The coins hit the desk with a sound like a gunshot. Lavinia Bristol stood in the doorway of the Finley Land and Loan office, her black mourning dress still carrying the dust of a 3-mile walk from the edge of town, her chin lifted at an angle that dared anyone in the world to call her defeated. In her left hand, she held a worn leather pouch. In her right hand, she held nothing, but her fingers were curled so tightly that her knuckles had gone the color of chalk. She had counted every coin inside that pouch no fewer than 6 times during the walk. $240. Every cent that Oliver Finley had lent her dead husband Thomas Bristol 14 months ago, plus what she calculated to be a fair measure of interest. Oliver Finley did not look up from the ledger on his desk right away. He had been working in this office since before the sun cleared the ridgeline, the way he always worked, the way people in Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1881 expected a serious man of business to work. When he finally raised his eyes, something moved through them, not surprise, not pity, something far more complicated before he locked it down behind the expression he wore like armor. "Mrs. Bristol," he said. His voice was careful, unhurried. The voice of a man who did not let things show. "Mr. Finley." She stepped fully into the office and placed the leather pouch on the corner of his desk with a precision that was its own kind of violence. $240. I believe that covers the principal and then some. He looked at the pouch. He did not touch it. "Sit down, Mrs. Bristol. I would rather stand." "I imagine you would." He closed the ledger slowly. "I'm not going to take that money." The silence that followed was not a peaceful kind of silence. It was the silence before a storm decides what it wants to destroy. "I beg your pardon," Lavinia said. The words came out very quiet, which was, for a woman who had survived the last 14 months, far more dangerous than shouting. "The loan was made under circumstances that—" "The loan was made, Mr. Finley, made to my husband. My husband is dead. The debt falls to me. I am paying the debt." She pushed the pouch another inch toward him as if the additional inch might make him understand the simple mechanics of what she was doing. "That is how the world works." "Not always," Oliver said. He stood from his chair, and the motion brought him to his full height, which was considerable, and for a moment the room felt smaller than it had. "Not in this particular case." "You will take this money," Lavinia said. "I will not." "Then I will leave it on your desk and walk out that door and consider the matter settled. Then I will have someone bring it back to your house before supper." Her eyes went dark in a way that had nothing to do with the light in the room. "Why?" she said. Just that word, just the single syllable of it, carrying everything she had not said, every dark night and hollow morning and quiet humiliation of the past year pressed into one small sound. "Why will you not take it?" Oliver Finley looked at her for a long moment. The clock on the wall measured out the seconds between them. "Because I never lent it to Thomas Bristol," he said. "I lent it to you." And that was where the real trouble began. Lavinia had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas with Thomas Bristol in the spring of 1879, which was to say she had arrived the way most women arrived in cattle towns along the Kishom Trail, not quite willingly, not quite accidentally, somewhere in the exhausting territory between hope and resignation. Thomas had come west chasing a dream about raising cattle on cheap land. The land turned out to be neither as cheap nor as fertile as the man who sold it to him had implied. The cattle dream became a smaller dream, and then a smaller one still, until what Thomas Bristol was raising in the fall of 1879 was mostly debt, and a particular kind of bitter hopefulness that men like him wore instead of a coat. Lavinia had been 26 when they married. She had been 27 when they arrived in Caldwell. She had been pretty and practical and possessed of a stubbornness that people sometimes mistook for arrogance until they understood it for what it actually was, which was survival. She had grown up in Ohio, the middle daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died early and left her daughters with the double-edged inheritance of self-reliance and loneliness. She had married Thomas because he was kind and eager, and because in the year 1877 in rural Ohio, the options available to a woman of 26 who wanted a life of her own were not as numerous as a person might hope. Thomas was not a bad man. This was the thing that made his failures so difficult to absorb. A bad man's failures have the clean logic of expected outcomes. Thomas Bristol was a genuinely good man who was genuinely bad at most of the practical things that mattered in the Kansas frontier, and the combination produced a specific kind of heartbreak that Lavinia carried in the muscles of her shoulders and the set of her jaw. Oliver Finley had been in Caldwell since 1876. He had come from Missouri with a modest inheritance and an immodest appetite for order in a place that was fundamentally resistant to it. He had established his land and loan business in the same year that Caldwell was beginning to establish itself as a serious cattle shipping point on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, and the timing had been fortunate. He was not a greedy man. He was precise and fair, and he had a reputation for doing what he said he would do, which in Caldwell in 1879 was a rarer quality than gold. He had met Thomas Bristol at the Merchants' Exchange, which was what people called the saloon when they were in polite company. Thomas had been 3 drinks deep into explaining his cattle scheme to anyone who would listen, and Oliver had listened not because he was fooled by the scheme, but because he found himself watching the woman sitting very still at the table near the window, the one who was clearly with the talking man, the one whose expression contained entire novels of patience and private calculation. He had introduced himself to Thomas the next morning, sober and businesslike. He had agreed to look at the Bristol property, which sat on 40 acres along Bluff Creek. He had assessed it honestly, which meant he had told Thomas Bristol the land was workable, but the plan as described was not. Thomas had revised the plan. Oliver had agreed to lend him $200 to purchase a small herd of mixed cattle, improve the creekside fencing, and carry the family through their first full winter in Kansas. Lavinia had been present at that meeting. She had not said much, but what she had said had been the clearest and most intelligent assessment of the situation Oliver had heard, and he had sat with the feeling that produced in him for several days afterward before he named it. He had given her the money, given it to Thomas in her presence, in October of 1879. What he had not put into the loan agreement, what he had never told a living soul, was that he had charged Thomas Bristol a quarter of the interest he charged any other borrower, and he had done this entirely because of the way Lavinia Bristol had looked at the fence line on the eastern edge of the property and said, quietly and without drama, "If we reinforce that fence and move it 10 yards north, we gain access to the best water on this side of the creek." She had been right. She had been right about the fence and about the grazing rotation and about half a dozen other things that Thomas incorporated into his operation in the months that followed. The cattle venture had not made the Bristols rich, but by the spring of 1880 it had made them stable, and Oliver had watched this from a careful distance and told himself that this was the appropriate level of involvement for a man in his position. Thomas Bristol had died in February of 1881. Not violently, not dramatically, which somehow made it worse. He had developed a fever in the second week of January that moved through his lungs with terrible efficiency, and he was dead before the month was out. He was 31 years old. Lavinia had sat with him through 3 weeks of illness without sleeping more than 4 hours at a stretch, had held his hand while his breathing became something mechanical, and then stopped, had buried him in the frozen ground of the Caldwell Cemetery on a gray Tuesday morning with 12 people present, and had returned to the 40 acres on Bluff Creek the same afternoon because the cattle still needed to be fed. She had managed the property alone for 5 months. She had hired one part-time hand, a steady older man named Court Davies who came 3 days a week and asked no questions and did exactly what was needed. She had sold 12 head of cattle at market in the spring at a price that was decent but not exceptional. She had repaired the south fence herself with tools and wire purchased from Henderson's hardware store on 3 separate visits because she could only carry so much at once. She had planted a kitchen garden that was doing respectably. She had been, by any observable measure, entirely and formidably fine. And then she had walked 3 miles in June heat carrying $240 in a leather pouch, and Oliver Finley had told her he would not take it, and nothing had been fine since. She walked home from his office with the leather pouch still in her hand because she had, in the moment, been too furious to leave it behind. She walked fast, the way she walked when she was thinking through something difficult, her boots raising small clouds of dust on the road east out of Caldwell. The midday sun was not kind. She didn't care. He had said he lent it to her. What in the name of everything reasonable did that mean? She turned the statement over during the walk the way you turn a stone you found in a field, looking for the hidden side of it. He had written the loan agreement in Thomas's name. She had watched him do it. The paper existed. She had found it in Thomas's writing desk 6 days after the funeral, tucked between a letter from his mother and an outdated seed catalog. She had read it 4 times. It said Thomas Bristol. It said $200 at an interest rate of 4% per annum. It had Thomas's signature and Oliver Finley's signature and the date, October 14, 1879. It did not say anything about Lavinia Bristol. I lent it to you. She stopped walking for a moment on the empty road and pressed the heel of her hand to her sternum, not because anything hurt precisely, but because something was moving around in her chest that she did not have room for, and she needed to push it back down. She did not trust what that statement made her feel. She did not trust it because she had been watching Oliver Finley from a careful distance for nearly 2 years, the same way he had apparently been watching her, and she had noticed things she was not supposed to notice. She had noticed that he was one of the few men in Caldwell who did not reduce her to a function wife, widow, property holder, when he spoke to her. She had noticed that when Thomas had described an idea badly, Oliver would look at her briefly, with an expression that was not quite shared amusement and not quite exasperation, but lived somewhere between them. She had noticed that after Thomas died, Oliver Finley had not come to offer hollow condolences and vaguely inappropriate suggestions about what she ought to do with the property. He had sent a note. 1 sentence. I am sorry for your loss. If anything is needed, I am available. She had read that note more times than the loan agreement. She had also noticed, and this was the one she had the most trouble with, that Oliver Finley was 32 years old and had never married, and that the women of Caldwell considered this both mysterious and promising, and that he met their interest with a courtesy so consistent it was almost like a closed door, and that she had no business whatsoever thinking about any of this. She was a widow. Her husband had been dead for 4 months. She had a property to run and a debt to pay, and absolutely no capacity for the kinds of feelings that were apparently attempting to set up residence in her chest without her permission. She put the leather pouch in the drawer of her writing desk when she got home. She told herself she would deal with it tomorrow. Tomorrow came. She did not go back to Oliver Finley's office. The day after tomorrow came. She did not go back. A week passed. She drove a stake into a fence post and hit it so hard the stake went in crooked and she had to pull it out and start again, and Court Davies watched from the other side of the fence line and said nothing, which she appreciated about him. On the 8th day, Oliver Finley came to Bluff Creek. She saw him coming up the road from the north while she was still in the kitchen garden, and she had approximately 45 seconds to decide what to do with the fact that her heart had done something completely unacceptable upon identifying him. She stayed where she was. She kept her hands in the dirt. She was replanting a section of beans that had been damaged by a late cold snap, and the beans were more important than whatever Oliver Finley thought he was doing arriving uninvited at her property on a Wednesday morning. He dismounted at the fence gate and tied his horse to the post with the unhurried competence of a man who had been around horses his whole life. He was wearing his usual dark trousers, white shirt, vest, the kind of practical hat that said a man worked in an office but knew the outdoors well enough to respect it. He was not wearing a gun, which she noticed because most men in Caldwell wore one, and the absence of it said something about the kind of visit this was meant to be. He came around the edge of the garden fence and stopped at a respectful distance. "Mrs. Bristol." "Mr. Finley." She did not stand up. "You've ridden 3 miles to say my name again." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I came to explain what I said poorly the other day. You said it clearly enough." "I said it truthfully," he said. "I didn't say it well." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. The sun was at his back, which meant she was squinting, which meant she had the disadvantage. And she thought he probably knew that and had positioned himself there anyway because Oliver Finley was the kind of man who thought 3 steps ahead and then felt guilty about it. "Explain it then," she said. He crouched down so they were at an approximate level, his forearms on his knees, which was a less formal posture than she had ever seen him take, and which was therefore slightly alarming. "When Thomas came to me in the fall of 1879, he said, he had a plan that required money. The plan, as he described it, was not quite sound, but you were there, and the things you said during that meeting, the adjustments you proposed, the specific way you understood the land, those were sound. Very sound." He paused. "I didn't lend Thomas Bristol $200 because of Thomas Bristol's plan. I lent it because I believed in your read of the situation. You were the reason I said yes." Lavinia looked at him for a long moment. A small wind moved through the bean rows. "That is a very convenient reinterpretation of a business transaction," she said. "It's not a reinterpretation. It's what I have known since October of 1879. You wrote Thomas's name on the agreement. He was the property holder. He was the legal party. The law required his name. Something shifted in his eyes, something she recognized as honest discomfort. I am not proud of the law in this particular respect." She turned back to the beans. She pulled a damaged plant from the soil with more force than was strictly necessary. "I do not want charity, Mr. Finley. I know that. What I'm offering is not charity." "Then what is it?" He was quiet for a moment. In the distance, one of her cattle made a sound near the water. "It is an acknowledgement," he said carefully, "that I benefited from your intelligence and your judgment on the day of that loan meeting, and that the $200 produced a return for you that you earned through your own work, and that I have no right to profit further from something that was, in the essential truth of it, your labor." Lavinia's hands went still in the dirt. She thought about that for a moment. She thought about how exactly like Oliver Finley it was to frame an act of personal feeling as a matter of principle, because a matter of principle was safe and a personal feeling was not. "That is a very principled argument," she said. "I believe in principled arguments." "I know you do." She stood up and brushed the soil from her hands and looked at him directly. He stood up as well. They were perhaps 4 feet apart, which was appropriate for a business conversation in a garden in 1881, and she was acutely aware of each of those 4 feet. "It is also," she said, "not the whole truth." He held her gaze. "No," he said after a moment, "it isn't." The word between them, the unspoken one, the one that was the actual whole truth, sat in the warm summer air like a held breath. "I am a widow of 4 months," Lavinia said. Her voice was steady. "I am not in a position to—" She stopped, reorganized. "I need to pay this debt, Mr. Finley. I need to pay it because I need to know that I am standing on ground that I have cleared myself. If I accept that money as a gift, I am standing on your generosity, and I will not build anything on a foundation I did not lay." He looked at her for a long time, and what she saw in his face was not argument. It was something much harder to defend against. It was understanding. "I hear you," he said. "Good. I still won't take the money." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an expletive. "You are the most frustrating man I have ever met." "So I've been told." He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a folded paper and held it out to her. "This is a proposal. Read it when you want to. Don't feel that you need to respond." She took it. She did not open it immediately, which cost her. He said goodbye with the same measured courtesy he brought to every human interaction and walked back to his horse and rode north toward town, and Lavinia stood in the kitchen garden with a folded piece of paper in her soil-darkened hand, and the feeling that something had just changed the shape of her horizon. She waited until she had finished the garden work, fed the cattle, and started the evening fire before she unfolded the paper. It was not a love letter. It was Oliver Finley, so of course it was not a love letter. It was a business proposal, written in his precise, legible hand, outlining a partnership arrangement by which she would retain full ownership and operational control of the Bristol property on Bluff Creek, while he would serve as a silent investor providing access to additional capital for herd expansion. The terms were written out in full. They were scrupulously fair. The interest rate was consistent with standard market rates, which was itself a kind of statement because, she knew, he gave preferential rates to borrowers he trusted, and charging her the market rate meant he was being scrupulously careful not to seem as though he was extending personal favor. At the bottom of the formal proposal, below his signature, he had written one additional line in slightly less formal script. You should not have to stand on someone else's generosity. You should not have to stand alone either. These are not mutually exclusive conditions. Lavinia read that line 4 times. Then she folded the paper and put it in her writing desk drawer next to the leather pouch with the $240, and she lay in her bed in the dark house on Bluff Creek and listened to the prairie wind and felt the full, complicated, terrifying weight of being a person who was beginning to want something she had not planned for. She did not sleep for a long time. In the morning she wrote him a letter. It was also because she was who she was, not an emotional letter. It was a counter-proposal. She kept his basic structure and modified 3 of the terms, including the profit-sharing arrangement, which she adjusted in his favor slightly, because she felt the original version had overcorrected in hers. She wrote 2 drafts and burned the first one because she caught herself starting to say something personal in the 4th paragraph, and crossed it out so heavily. It was no longer legible, and decided starting over was cleaner. She sealed the 2nd draft and drove it to the post office herself rather than sending it with Court Davies, because she was not yet ready for anyone in Caldwell to know that Oliver Finley and Lavinia Bristol were exchanging documents. This, as it turned out, was optimistic. Caldwell, Kansas in 1881 had a population of roughly 1,500 people during cattle drive season and slightly fewer in the off months, and it had exactly the information-sharing infrastructure of any small settlement that had grown quickly from a raw frontier outpost into a genuine commercial town, which was to say that everyone knew everything approximately 6 hours after it happened. 2 women at the dry goods store on the same day Lavinia mailed her letter had already noted that Oliver Finley had ridden the Bluff Creek Road on Wednesday, and the theory that this was a professional call was being evaluated with considerable skepticism. Lavinia was aware of the scrutiny. She had been aware of it since the week after the funeral, when the assessment of her situation, a young widow alone on 40 acres, no family in the territory, a reasonable-looking property, had shifted from sympathy to something more evaluative in the eyes of certain men around town. She had managed this with a combination of directness and cold dignity that had been, thus far, effective. The problem with Oliver Finley was that she could not manage him. He was not pressing. He was not presuming. He was not doing any of the things she had a practiced response to. He was simply being entirely, quietly, devastatingly decent, and she had no armor against that. His response to her counter-proposal arrived 4 days later, hand-delivered by a boy from town rather than through the post, which told her he wanted it to arrive faster than the postal system allowed, and that he was not, beneath the careful exterior, as unbothered as he appeared. The response accepted her modifications with a note that said he found them reasonable and that her instinct about the profit-sharing ratio was, on reflection, correct. At the bottom, "Your letter was clearer than I deserved." She read that and laughed, alone in her kitchen, and the sound surprised her, the realness of it, the way it came from somewhere she had forgotten she had. They signed the formal agreement on a Tuesday morning in his office. He had prepared 2 copies on proper legal paper, and had a witness present in the form of Judge Aldous Merritt, who was 60 years old and absolutely impassive, and who signed both copies without expression, and excused himself with minimal ceremony. Oliver and Lavinia signed their names on the same line of the same document for the first time, and when the pen left Lavinia's hand, she looked at the 2 signatures side by side and felt something she chose not to name out loud. Oliver filed 1 copy with the county record's office. Lavinia took the other one home and put it in her writing desk, in the drawer that was becoming something of an archive. "The money from the original loan," she said as she was gathering her copy to leave. "Gone," he said. "I've considered it settled." She looked at him. "I'm accepting that," she said, under protest. "Noted," he said, and she caught the smile he almost managed to contain. The summer progressed. The partnership arrangement was working well, in fact. Oliver had access to better market information than Lavinia could obtain on her own, and his connections along the cattle trading networks meant she could sell at better prices and buy replacement stock more economically. She expanded the herd to 32 head by August, which was modest but real progress, and the Bluff Creek property was producing enough to sustain itself and generate a small margin. He visited the property once every 2 weeks on what they had established as formal business days. He would arrive at 9 in the morning. They would review the operational details and the financial records at the kitchen table, and he would leave by 11. These meetings were entirely professional. They were also, for Lavinia, the organizing principle around which the rest of the 2 weeks arranged themselves, and she suspected she was not the only one for whom this was true. She began to know him in increments, the way you know someone when the knowing has to stay inside the permitted channels of professional exchange, and everything personal seeps through the edges. She learned that he had grown up in a small town outside St. Joseph, Missouri, the oldest of 3 brothers, which explained something about the way he took responsibility without making a performance of it. She learned that he had studied accounting for 2 years in St. Louis, before deciding the city made him feel like a man living inside someone else's idea of a life. She learned that he read actual books, ordered from back east, stacked with careful precision on the shelves behind his office desk, and that his taste ran toward history and natural philosophy, and one shelf of poetry that he had never once acknowledged in her presence, but that she had catalogued on her first visit and thought about frequently. She learned that he was funny in a way that required you to be paying attention. He did not tell jokes. He said things that were precise and observational and dry and true, and if you were listening closely enough they were hilarious, and if you laughed he would look at you with something like relief, as though he had been waiting to find out if you were paying attention. She was always paying attention. In September, a problem arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Cook. Gerald Cook was 51 years old and owned the second largest cattle operation in the county, and had been a widower himself for 3 years and had, until recently, been directing his remarriage ambitions toward a widow in Wichita who had apparently resolved the situation in another direction. He appeared at the Bluff Creek property on a Saturday morning uninvited, with a bottle of good whiskey and a friendly manner that was not as casual as it presented itself. He wanted to buy the Bristol property. He made this clear over the course of a conversation that lasted 20 minutes longer than Lavinia wanted it to, during which he described the offer as generous, which it was, considerably above market value, and emphasized several times that a woman alone managing a cattle property faced challenges that a business merger could resolve more easily than continued solo operation. At which point, Lavinia understood that the offer for the property was not separate from a more comprehensive proposal that he had not quite articulated yet, but was clearly moving toward. She told him the property was not for sale. He smiled in a way that suggested he had expected this and was not deterred by it. "You have a partnership arrangement with Finley," he said, as though this were something she might have forgotten. "I do," she said. "A limited arrangement, land improvement, stock capital." He said this with the particular tone of a man who has done his research. "Doesn't cover everything a property like this needs." "I am managing quite well," Lavinia said, and her voice had gone to that very quiet, very controlled register that was, for people who knew her, a significant warning. Cook did not know her well enough. He left eventually, with the bottle of whiskey still in his hand because she had declined it, and the Saturday morning resumed its normal shape, except that it didn't quite because Lavinia stood at the kitchen window for several minutes after his horse disappeared up the road and felt something cold and purposeful settle in her stomach. She told Oliver about the visit at their next meeting. His reaction was contained because his reactions were always contained, but she watched his hand still over the ledger and knew the containment was working harder than usual. "He's been asking about the property," Oliver said. It was not quite a question. "Among other things." Oliver looked at her. She let him understand what she meant by "among other things." "You're not interested," he said. "No," she said, simply, "I am not." He looked back at the ledger. His pen moved. "He'll come back." "I expect so. You should know that he's been suggesting around town that your arrangement here," a small pause, careful, "is irregular, in terms of what it implies about your reputation." Lavinia set down her coffee cup with a very deliberate steadiness. "He is suggesting that a business partnership between a widow and a loan officer is improper. He is suggesting that it implies a personal relationship of a nature that would make me a woman of poor judgment or poor character," she said. Yes, I understood his arithmetic. She looked at Oliver across the table. "Is it affecting your business?" "No." "Is it affecting your reputation?" He met her eyes. "Men's reputations do not work the same way." "No," she said, "they don't." She picked up her coffee cup again. "I am not going to sell my property or alter my arrangements because Gerald Cook wants to control either of them." "Good," Oliver said, "just that, good." But she could see that the Cook situation was sitting on him in a particular way, and she thought she understood why, because it named a thing that was between them, named it sideways, by implication, in the worst possible way, and the naming of it, even badly and from a hostile source, had changed something about the air in the kitchen. After he left that day, she stood at the kitchen door and watched him ride north and thought with unusual clarity about what she actually wanted. What she wanted, she admitted to herself in the full light of a September afternoon, was Oliver Finley, not the business arrangement, not the professional visits, not the careful calibrated distance they were both maintaining with significant effort. She wanted the man who wrote, "You should not have to stand alone," either, at the bottom of a business proposal, because it was the closest he could get to saying something true. She wanted the dry, precise humor and the shelf of poetry he would not acknowledge, and the way he crouched down in the garden to put himself at her level, and the specific expression on his face when she said something he recognized as correct. She had been a widow for 7 months. She was 29 years old. She had worked extremely hard and grieved honestly and paid her debts and managed her land, and she was, she decided, no longer willing to pretend that an appropriate period of adjustment was the same thing as the permanent suppression of being alive. But she was not going to say it first. She was not going to say it first because if she had misread him, if the shelf of poetry and the bottom of the business proposal and the crouching in the garden were all, in fact, simply the gestures of a decent man toward a neighbor he respected, the humiliation would be total, and the working relationship they had built would become impossible, and she could not afford to lose either the relationship or the financial arrangement, and she had too much pride to survive that kind of mistake. So she waited. In October, Gerald Cook came back. He did not come to the Bluff Creek property this time. He came to Oliver Finley's office, which Lavinia did not know until afterward. Oliver told her about it at the next Tuesday meeting, and his account of it was characteristically precise and drained of the emotional content she had to infer from the spaces between his sentences. Cook had proposed that Oliver buy out Lavinia's property, essentially, arrange financing on terms that would make it easy for her to sell and difficult for her to maintain. He had framed this as doing her a favor, giving her a clean exit from a difficult situation. He had implied, with the practiced obliqueness of a man who had spent years finding the line between what you could say and what you couldn't, that Oliver's continued professional proximity to a young widow was attracting the kind of attention that neither of their reputations could indefinitely support. "What did you say?" Lavinia asked. Oliver's eyes were very steady. "I told him that the Bristol property on Bluff Creek was a sound and functioning operation, that the partnership arrangement was entirely legal and above reproach, and that I was not in the business of pressuring clients to sell assets they did not wish to sell. And then, a pause. And then I told him that the next time he found it necessary to make implications about you, he should do so in a context where the implications were clearly audible and there were witnesses present, because I was not willing to have that kind of conversation at the edges of what could be said and denied." Lavinia looked at him for a moment. "You threatened him," she said. "I informed him of the conditions under which I was willing to continue the discussion." Oliver. It was the first time she had used his given name out loud, and she felt both of them register it. "You threatened a man on my behalf." Something in his face moved. "I protected an arrangement that is important to me on professional and personal grounds." "Which grounds specifically?" The clock on the kitchen wall counted out several seconds. "Lavinia," he said, and her name in his mouth was careful and direct and nothing like what she had braced for. "You know what grounds?" She did. She had known for months. And she realized, sitting across her own kitchen table from him with October light coming through the window and the leather pouch in the drawer of the writing desk, and the signed agreement in the same drawer and everything they had been carefully building in the space between professional and personal, that the time for pretending she didn't know was finished. "I am not ready," she said. "Honest. Completely honest. I don't mean that I mean that I am still." She stopped. "Thomas was a good man. I am still finding out what it means that he is gone. I am still becoming whoever I am when I am not someone's wife, and I do not yet know what I will be when I am done becoming it." Oliver nodded. He did not push. He did not retreat. He simply said, "I know. I'm not asking you to be ready." "What are you asking?" He thought about it for a moment with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything. "I am asking you to know that I am here, that the fact of me being here is not contingent on any particular answer or timeline." That he paused and seemed to make a decision. "That the money I gave Thomas Bristol in 1879 was given because of you, and the partnership I proposed in the summer was proposed because of you, and every Tuesday morning I have come to this kitchen because of you, and I am not prepared to apologize for any of it, but I am also not willing to push something that deserves to be arrived at freely." Lavinia looked at him for a long time. "That is," she said carefully, "the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." "Good," he said. "I meant it to be." They sat for a while in the kitchen with the October light, and the sound of cattle in the distance, and the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have finally said the true things, and are adjusting to the new shape of the world. Then she handed him the quarterly ledger and they got back to work, because the cattle still needed to be accounted for, and the fence on the south pasture was showing wear, and the winter feed stocks needed to be evaluated. And this was life, and it was not unromantic. The winter of 1881 to 1882 was a hard one on the Kansas plains. The cold came early and stayed late, and the cattle operations around Caldwell took losses that ranged from inconvenient to ruinous, depending on how well prepared each outfit had been. The Bristol property on Bluff Creek was prepared, because Lavinia had begun building up winter stores in September, and had modified the windbreak on the north side of the pasture in October with materials sourced through Oliver's supplier contacts. They lost 2 head in January, which was a real loss but not a damaging one. The herd came through the winter at 30 head and in reasonable condition. During the winter months, Oliver's visits shifted from strictly bi-weekly to more frequent, justified by the weather-related complications that required more active management of the financial side of the operation. He helped with several practical tasks during some of these visits, not in a way that overstepped or implied she needed the help, but in the natural way of a person who is present and sees something that needs doing. He fixed a frozen water pump in January and didn't mention it again. He showed up with a load of additional hay in February when an early February storm came in worse than predicted and the feed estimate came up short. Lavinia invited him to supper for the first time on a Thursday in February during the storm. He had arrived with the hay, and it was clear the storm was closing in faster than his ride back to town. She made the invitation practical stay for supper. The weather was not fit for travel. The spare room was available if the storm held, and he accepted it in the same practical register. Supper was venison stew and cornbread and dried apple preserves and strong coffee, and it lasted 2 hours because they had things to talk about, and the storm howled outside, and neither of them was trying very hard to end the evening. She had a copy of a recent issue of Harper's Weekly that he had sent out from town, and they talked about the articles in it, and he had opinions she hadn't expected, and she had counter-opinions he hadn't expected, and the counter-opinions turned into a full debate about railroad land policy that left both of them laughing and energized at 10 o'clock on a February night. He slept in the spare room. He was gone before she was up in the morning. A note on the kitchen table. Storm clear. Thank you for the stew, it was excellent. Oh, she read the note and pressed it flat with her palm and held it there for a moment on the table's surface. She put it in the drawer with the other things. Spring came to Bluff Creek with the sudden aggressive green of Kansas in April, and Lavinia Bristol turned 30 years old on a Tuesday and did not tell anyone. Oliver arrived for the regular meeting and found a birthday cake on the kitchen table, which confused him for approximately 3 seconds before she told him, with complete composure, that she had made it herself because she was 30 years old, and she felt the occasion warranted cake regardless of whether anyone else knew about it. He looked at the cake and then at her and said, "Happy birthday," in a voice that she had never heard from him before, a voice that did not have the careful measured quality in it, that was just direct and warm and real. "Thank you," she said, with equal directness. Then she cut 2 pieces and they had cake with the ledger open on the table, which was, she thought, almost exactly the right way to be 30 years old. He brought her a book the following Tuesday. It was a collection of natural history essays, properly chosen, the kind of book that was precisely right for her, informative and scientifically curious and beautifully observed, and he had written on the inside front cover, in the same slightly less formal script as the bottom of the original business proposal. "For your birthday, which I was glad to be told about, even a week late. O.F." She read the inscription 3 times and then read the book in 4 days. In May, she rode into Caldwell on an errand that took her past the offices of Gerald Cook's operation on the main street, and Cook came out of his door as she was passing and made a point of stopping her. He was pleasant, in the surface way he had, and the pleasantness had an edge to it that she had learned to read. He mentioned that he had heard Oliver Finley had been spending considerable time out at the Bluff Creek property. He said this with a particular emphasis on considerable. He asked, with what he clearly believed was the appropriate degree of casual concern, whether she had thought further about the purchase offer. Lavinia looked at him from her horse with complete calm. "Mr. Cook," she said, "I want to be very direct with you because I think clarity is kinder than its alternatives. The property is not for sale. My arrangements with Mr. Finley are professional and mutually beneficial and entirely my own business. I am not in need of advice about how to manage either. I hope your cattle operation has a good season." She rode on before he could respond. She felt his eyes on her back until she rounded the corner, and she felt the slight elevated heat of someone who has said exactly what they meant and does not regret a word of it. She mentioned the exchange to Oliver that evening, because she had taken to stopping by his office when she was in town for other reasons, which had happened often enough by May that it was no longer remarkable. He was behind his desk when she came in, and he listened to her account with his elbows on the desk and his hands folded under his chin. "He's not going to stop," Oliver said. "No, but he's also not going to win anything." She sat down in the chair across from his desk. "He doesn't have leverage over anything real. He has gossip and implications and a purchase offer I don't want." "He has connections," Oliver said. "The Merchants' Association, the county assessor's office. If he wanted to make things complicated for the property, he'd have to do something that left a mark," Lavinia said. "And then it wouldn't be implications anymore. It would be something I could address directly." She met his eyes. "I'm not afraid of Gerald Cook." "I know that," Oliver said. "I just want to make sure you know he might try to force a situation. Then we deal with it when he does." She looked at him steadily. "We, Mr. Finley, that is a pronoun I am using intentionally." Something shifted in his face. The careful quality dropped for a moment, and what was underneath it was something so direct and unguarded that Lavinia felt it in her sternum. "Good," he said. His voice was quiet. "I'm glad you mean it." "I do." The silence between them had a different quality than it used to. It was fuller, less contained. It was the silence of two people who have said most of the true things and are existing in the space between most and all. Cook did make a move, as Oliver had predicted. In June, he filed a complaint with the county land office claiming a disputed boundary on the east side of the Bristol property, arguing that a section of fence line along Bluff Creek encroached on land he claimed to own. It was, Oliver told her when she came to his office with the notice, a manufactured complaint. The boundary had been surveyed and registered in 1879, and the Bristol claim was clean. But it would require a response, and a formal survey, and several weeks of process, and the implicit cost of that process time, legal fees. The anxiety of a contested claim was part of the strategy, making things difficult enough that selling became the easier option. Lavinia read the notice sitting in the chair across from Oliver's desk with her hands very still in her lap. "What do we do?" she asked. "We respond immediately, formally, and with complete documentation," Oliver said. He was already at his filing cabinet. "I have the original survey from 1879 and the complete land registration records. I will have Judge Merritt review the claim today. By my assessment, Cook's claim has no legal basis, but he is hoping the process itself creates enough pressure to make me feel isolated and overwhelmed," Lavinia said. "Yes, I understand his strategy." Oliver stopped and looked at her. His expression was calm and direct and had that underlying steadiness she had come to depend on more than she wanted to admit. "You are not isolated," he said, "and I do not believe you are easily overwhelmed." "I am not," she agreed. "But I appreciate you saying it." He held her gaze for a moment, and she thought that if they were in any other situation, not an office, not a professional context, not 1881 with all its constraints about what was acceptable and when he would be doing something that was not looking. She thought about this and kept it to herself. "I'll prepare the response today," he said. "I'll need you to sign the documentation." "I'll stay," she said. "Tell me what you need." They worked through the afternoon on it. She sat across from him at the large office table and reviewed documents and signed where required and asked questions about the legal process that he answered with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. At some point, she stopped noticing the professional formality of it and became aware of the simple fact of the two of them working at the same table, with the afternoon light moving across the floor and the sound of Caldwell going about its business outside the windows. And the intimacy of it, the plain daily intimacy of working closely with someone you trust absolutely, was more disarming than anything dramatic would have been. Judge Merritt reviewed the claim the next day and filed the county's response within the week. The original survey stood. Cook's claim was dismissed without a hearing. He did not try a second time. Lavinia learned about the dismissal from Oliver on a Thursday morning at the Bluff Creek property, where he had come for what was technically a business call, and had ended up staying through the afternoon. They had walked the fence line together after the business was concluded, not because either of them needed to, but because it was a fine June afternoon, and there was something about the Bluff Creek property in early summer that made walking it feel worthwhile. She showed him the place on the east boundary where the old fence line marker stood, the one that had been the center of Cook's claim. It was a stone marker, set by the original surveyor in 1879, solid and completely unambiguous about where the boundary ran. She put her hand on the top of the stone and felt the sun-warmed surface of it. "He thought I didn't know my own land," she said. "He underestimated you consistently," Oliver said. He was standing beside her, close enough that the sleeve of his shirt was at the edge of her peripheral vision. "People do," she said. "It used to make me angry. Now I find it useful." "I did not underestimate you," he said. "Not once, from the first time I heard you speak." She looked at him. "I know," she said. They stood by the boundary marker in the June sun, and the creek made its sound in the near distance, and the cattle grazed in the middle pasture, and the moment was entirely simple and entirely enormous. "Lavinia," he said. "Oliver," the names. Their names, just their names in each other's voices, and all the months of careful approach and honest conversation and professional patience arrived in that moment, and she understood that they had, without either of them declaring it, passed through the threshold they had been standing outside of all year. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was warm from the sun and his grip was careful and real, and she turned to face him and found his expression completely unguarded for the first time, the armor entirely down, and what was on his face was what she had known was there for months and had not quite let herself look at directly. "I do not want to rush anything that matters," he said. "I want to do this correctly." "Then do it correctly," she said. She squeezed his hand once firmly and did not let go. "But do it." He looked at her for a long moment with the full weight of everything he felt, and then he did something she had not anticipated. He laughed. A real laugh, quiet and genuine, the laugh of a man releasing something he has been holding for a very long time. "I have wanted to say," he stopped, tried again. "Lavinia, I love you. I have loved you, I believe, since you stood in a field and told me a fence needed to move 10 yards north, and I have been waiting since then for a moment in which it was right to say so." The creek ran. The cattle grazed. The Kansas sky was enormous and blue, and somewhere in Caldwell, a man was probably noting the time Oliver Finley had not returned from his business call. "I love you," she said. It came out with the same clear directness as everything she said when she had decided to say it. "I have been fighting that fact since approximately the moment I stopped being angry at you for not taking my money." He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly, formally, carefully to his lips, the way a man does when he is being deliberate about how he expresses something large. Then he looked at her with a smile that was small and precise and entirely real. "I still do not want your money," he said. She laughed. Her own real laugh, the one she had not been able to stop that day in her kitchen months ago. It felt like something opening. "You are," she said, "extraordinary." They walked back to the house hand in hand along the fence line of the Bluff Creek property, and the prairie was green and alive around them. And Lavinia Bristol felt, for the first time in 2 years, the particular sensation of standing on ground she had cleared herself and sharing it with someone she had chosen freely. He courted her in the formal sense of the word through the summer and into the fall, which in Caldwell in 1882 meant calling on her with regular appropriate notice, attending church together on Sundays when her schedule permitted, and being seen at public occasions such as the county fair in August and the Merchants Association harvest dinner in September in a way that made their connection clear without being presumptuous about its nature. The gossip shifted from the vaguely scandalous to the approvingly romantic, which is how these things work in small towns when the parties involved are people that the community on balance respects. Gerald Cook had, following the dismissal of his land claim, redirected his attention towards several other ventures that kept him busy enough to leave the Bristol property alone. His name came up less and less, and what had seemed like a significant threat resolved into what it had always been: a man with bad intentions and insufficient leverage. And Lavinia let him disappear from her calculations with the same practicality she applied to everything. Court Davies, who had been working the Bristol property 3 days a week since the month after Thomas's death, became a full-time hand in September when the herd expansion made the additional labor necessary. He was a quiet, competent man in his late 50s who had never once asked a personal question, but had the kind of steady observational intelligence that meant he noticed everything. The week after Oliver started coming to Sunday services, Court showed up on Monday morning and said, apropos of nothing, "Good man, Finley," and then got on with the fence repair and never mentioned it again. Lavinia appreciated this more than she could say. She asked Oliver to marry her in October. She had thought about it carefully, had assessed her own feelings with the rigor she brought to anything important, had decided that waiting for him to ask while being entirely certain of her own answer was the kind of unnecessary delay that made no sense in a life that had already taught her the cost of time. She drove into Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon, walked into his office, closed the door, and told him she had a proposal. He looked up from his ledger with an expression that was already beginning to shift. "A business proposal?" he asked, and the slight edge of awareness in his voice told her he had already understood. "No," she said, "a different kind. I am proposing that we get married, Oliver Finley. I have thought about it at length, and I believe it is the correct decision for both of us." He stared at her for approximately 3 seconds. "You are proposing to me," he said. "I am. In my office. Where else would I propose to you? You are in your office most of the time." The expression on his face was something she would carry for the rest of her life. It started with disbelief and moved through several things quickly and arrived at something that was so open and so full that she felt it change the air in the room. "Yes," he said. He stood up from his chair. "Yes, obviously, Lavinia." He came around the desk and she had taken 2 steps toward him, and then his arms were around her and she put her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, really held, for the first time in a very long time, and the sensation of it, the simple physical fact of being held by someone who knew her and loved her and was not going anywhere, was overwhelming in the most completely good way. "You are remarkable," he said into her hair. "I know," she said, which made him laugh again, the quiet, real laugh, and she felt it against her cheek and thought, This is what it is supposed to feel like." They were married in November of 1882 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, on a Saturday that turned out cold and clear and bright, the sky that particular shade of pale winter blue that makes everything sharper than usual. Judge Merritt, being both a practical and a sentimental man, performed the ceremony. Court Davies attended in a suit that appeared to have been kept in a box since the previous decade. Oliver's younger brother William had come from Missouri for the occasion, and stood as best man, and spent most of the reception being delightedly astonished that his famously guarded older brother had found himself a woman who proposed to him in his own office. Lavinia thought she liked William enormously. The vows were standard. She had considered writing different ones but decided the standard ones, said with full meaning, were more powerful than personalized ones said with partial attention. And when she said "I do," she said it with the same precision and directness she brought to everything, looking Oliver in the eyes, meaning every syllable. When the ceremony was over and they were standing outside the church in the cold November air with the small crowd of Caldwell residents around them, Oliver took both of her hands in his and looked at her with the unguarded expression she had come to love most and said, very quietly so that only she could hear, "I have been looking for a reason not to be careful for a very long time. You are a very good reason." She put her hand against his jaw. "You can still be careful," she said. "Just be careful with me." "Always," he said, and she knew he meant it the way he meant everything, precisely, completely, permanently. They spent the first night of their marriage at the Bluff Creek property, which felt right to both of them. The house that Thomas Bristol had built and Lavinia had maintained, and which now belonged to both of them, was lit from inside against the cold night, and the cattle were settled in the winter pasture, and the Kansas stars were extraordinary overhead. Oliver built the fire up while Lavinia made coffee, and they sat in front of it for a while talking about nothing urgent, and Lavinia thought, "This is ordinary and it is everything." The winter of 1882 to 1883 was gentler than the previous one. The property was better prepared. The partnership arrangement that had been a formal legal document became something they lived inside together, both of them bringing their different skills to the same operation. Her knowledge of the land and the cattle and the daily management, his knowledge of finance and markets, and the larger networks that connected a 40-acre, creekside operation to the wider world of commerce. Oliver kept his office in Caldwell. He continued his loan and land business. Lavinia did not ask him to give it up because she understood that it was part of who he was, and because she had no desire to marry someone and then reshape them into a different person. She drove into town with him 3 days a week and spent time at the property the other days, and the arrangement was practical and it was theirs. She became pregnant in the spring of 1883. She told him on a Tuesday morning in April at the kitchen table, over coffee, with the directness she brought to important news. She watched his face and saw the rapid processing, the check of concern: is she all right? Is everything all right? And then below that, surfacing and taking over, a joy so complete and undefended that it looked for a moment like a different kind of emotion. His eyes had gone bright. He reached across the table and took her hand without speaking for a moment. "Are you well?" He said. "I am very well," she said. "I'm in fact better than well. I'm annoyed that I cannot lift the feed bags without court hovering, but that will pass." He laughed. He brought her hand up to his mouth and kissed it, and his expression over her knuckles was everything. "A child," he said. "Our child," she said. He held her hand for a long time. "I did not know," he started and stopped. "What?" "I did not know I wanted this quite so much until this moment," he said. "I find that surprising." "Oliver Finley," she said, "you have wanted this since before you would admit you wanted anything." She squeezed his hand. "I hope it is a boy. I would like him to have your eyes." "I would like them to have your mind," he said. "Regardless of the eyes," she laughed. "Both," she said. "Both would be good." The pregnancy progressed well through the summer. Lavinia continued working the property with adjustments as necessary. Which is to say, she continued working the property almost exactly as before and made strategic concessions about specific physical tasks that she privately agreed were sensible, while maintaining her general position that pregnancy was a condition to be managed, rather than an incapacitation. Oliver understood this about her and adapted his concern accordingly, which meant making sure things were available and handled without making a project of it, without treating her as fragile, without adding to her life the additional labor of managing someone else's anxiety. This was one of the things she loved about him, that he understood the difference between supporting someone and smothering them, that he had figured this out about her early and had calibrated accordingly ever since. William Finley came back from Missouri in October, this time with his wife Margaret and their 2 young children, making it a proper family occasion. They stayed at a Caldwell boarding house and came to dinner at Bluff Creek twice during the week. Oliver with his brother was a slightly different Oliver, easier, more ready to laugh, the oldest child carefulness softened by the familiarity of being known since childhood. Lavinia liked watching it. She told Oliver afterward that she liked William very much and that she hoped they would visit often. "He likes you considerably," Oliver said. "He told me you were the only woman who could have made me make sense." "That is," Lavinia said, "possibly the most accurate thing William has ever said." Their son was born in December of 1883 in the house on Bluff Creek, attended by the town's physician Dr. Heber Walsh and the local midwife Mrs. Grace Calloway, who between them had a combined century of practical experience, and who worked together with an efficiency that Lavinia, in retrospect, deeply appreciated. The birth was hard, births often were, and it went on longer than anyone preferred, and at approximately 3 in the morning Oliver, who had been holding her hand through the whole of it, said something very quietly that she would not be able to recall precisely afterward, but that had been addressed only to her, and that had been the most honest expression of fear and love she had ever heard from him. She made it through. The child made it through. Oliver Finley held his son at 3:30 in the morning in the kitchen of the Bluff Creek property with the fire going and the December dark outside, and looked at him with the expression of a man whose careful precision has just met something that entirely defeats it. "Hello," he said to the baby. Quiet and direct, the way he said everything. "Hello." Lavinia watched from where she was, exhausted and entirely present, and felt the full weight of having arrived at this particular moment, this particular life, this child in this man's arms in this house on this creek in the Kansas winter. And it was not what she had planned, and it was not what she had expected, and it was so exactly what she needed that the difference between those things dissolved. They named him Thomas Oliver Finley. Thomas for the man who had come west with hope and had been genuinely good and had died too young. Oliver because the child was also his father's. Lavinia had proposed both names, and Oliver had been silent for a moment and then said, "Yes," in a voice that was not entirely steady, and that was that. Thomas Oliver was a quiet, watchful baby who became a curious, steady child. He had Oliver's eyes and Lavinia's particular quality of paying attention, which manifested as early as his 2nd year in the way he would observe a situation carefully before acting in it. Oliver found this delightful, and said so frequently. Lavinia found it familiar and said nothing, but her expression when she watched her son assess the world said everything. The Bluff Creek property continued to grow. By 1885, the herd was at 60 head, and the annual operation was producing a consistent return that made the Bristol Finley household one of the more secure small cattle operations in the county. Oliver had taken on a junior partner in his Caldwell office, a young man named Ezra Doyle who was meticulous and honest, and who took over enough of the day-to-day work that Oliver could spend 3 full days a week at the property instead of 2. Lavinia had expanded the kitchen garden into a proper market garden in 1884, adding enough acreage to supply a share of produce to Caldwell's general stores through the summer months. This had been her idea entirely, proposed to Oliver over the winter, and he had responded with complete interest and no surprise whatsoever, because he had never been surprised by the range of her ideas, only by the fact that the world had spent so long creating conditions in which most of them had to wait. In 1886, she was pregnant again. She told him in the same way directly at the kitchen table over coffee, and his face did the same rapid processing and the same unclosing into joy, and she smiled at the consistency of it. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair, which was a gesture she recognized from the very early days, the garden, the first real conversation, and she put her hand on his face and he turned his head to press his lips to her palm. "Thomas will be a brother," he said. "He will be an excellent one," she said. "He is very good at watching out for things." Their 2nd child was a girl, born in the fall of 1886. They named her Clara Ann Finley Ann for Lavinia's mother, and she came into the world with a completeness of opinion that was apparent from the first hour, and that did not diminish as she grew. Thomas, at 2½, received his sister with the careful seriousness of a child who had been told something important was happening and had decided to take this seriously. He sat beside Lavinia and looked at the baby for a long time and then said, "She is very small," with a philosophical acceptance that made Court Davies, who was visible through the kitchen doorway, make a sound that was close to a laugh. Life on Bluff Creek in the middle 1880s was not easy in the way that nothing in Kansas in the 1880s was exactly easy. The weather was variable, and the cattle market had seasons of difficulty, and there was always work to be done, and things that required attention and fixing and negotiation. But it was a full life, genuinely full, in a way that Lavinia had not known it could be when she arrived in Kansas in 1879 with a hopeful husband and a practical heart, and no particular expectation of happiness. She thought about Thomas Bristol sometimes, with an honesty that she thought would have pleased him. She thought about what he had been, truly good, genuinely kind, not equipped for the life he had tried to build, and she felt for him the kind of settled, non-guilty tenderness that comes when enough time has passed and enough life has been lived that grief has found its proper size. She had kept his name on the property deed when she and Oliver had consolidated the legal arrangements, noting that the land had been his first, and Oliver had agreed with the same quiet respect for what was accurate and true. She had also kept the leather pouch in the drawer of her writing desk. The original one, the one she had carried 3 miles in June heat with $240 inside. She had returned the money to circulation. It had gone into the first herd expansion, properly accounted for in the partnership records, but the pouch itself she had kept, because it was the physical record of the day she had walked into Oliver Finley's office with her chin up and her dignity intact, and her entire future about to change in a way she had not yet imagined. Oliver knew she had kept it. He had found it in the drawer one day, years later, and picked it up with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when something moved him, and he was not going to make a performance of it. "You kept this," he said. "I did." He turned it over in his hands. "It is empty." "The money is in the cattle, as it should be." She looked at him. "The pouch is mine." He set it carefully back in the drawer. "It was always yours," he said. Caldwell grew and changed through the second half of the 1880s. The cattle drives along the Kishom Trail were tapering as the railroads extended further west and the Kansas settlement pushed the open range further south. The town was settling into a different version of itself, less wild, more established, the frontier character softening into something more permanent and civic. New buildings, a proper school by 1887. A library association that Lavinia joined and eventually helped organize, because she had books and opinions and time to spare on the subject. Oliver became more involved in local affairs as his business continued to grow. He served on the County Land Commission in 1887, which was the kind of role suited to a man who combined financial expertise with a genuine sense of fairness. Lavinia attended the commission meetings when she could and sat in the back row, and said nothing during the proceedings, but Oliver had learned to read her facial expressions during his years of living with her, and occasionally she would see him adjust an argument in response to something he caught in her eyes, and she would feel a deep, quiet satisfaction at the way they functioned together. They had a third child in 1889. A boy again, James Henry Finley, named for Oliver's father and Lavinia's maternal grandfather, and another combination they arrived at together over the kitchen table on a winter evening with the children asleep and the fire going. James came into the world in May with the full expression of someone who has already decided he will do everything as quickly as possible, which proved prophetic. He walked at 10 months. He talked in full sentences by 18 months. He climbed everything. Oliver, confronted with James's absolute commitment to upward movement, said on one particular afternoon when the child had scaled the side fence for the 3rd time before noon, "I see you in him." "You see me in him," Lavinia said. "The certainty that the world is a thing to be engaged with directly and immediately," Oliver said. "Yes." Lavinia looked at her youngest child, who was now attempting the gate post, and felt a complicated, enormous love for all of it, the child, the man, the property, the life. "He will be fine," she said. "He will be extraordinary," Oliver said, "like his mother." She looked at him sidelong. "You have gotten considerably less restrained over the years." "I have had an excellent example," he said, and the smile was small and real and entirely his. In 1890, on a Thursday in June, Lavinia drove into Caldwell for a supply run and stopped at Oliver's office on the way back, the way she always stopped. Ezra Doyle was at the front desk, and Oliver was at the back table reviewing the quarterly accounts, and Thomas Oliver, who was 6.5 and had been allowed to come to town on this particular Thursday as a special occasion, was sitting very still in the corner chair reading a book he had chosen from Oliver's office shelf, because Thomas had been reading since he was 4 and had immediately understood that his father's office shelf was a significant resource. She stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone noticed her and looked at the scene. Her husband at the accounts table, her son in the corner with a book, the afternoon light through the windows, the sound of Caldwell going about its business outside. She thought about a June day in 1881, 9 years ago, when she had walked into this same office with a leather pouch and a determination to settle a debt, and had been told no by a man who had already been, without her knowledge, reorganizing his entire interior life around the fact of her. She thought about everything that had refused to stay simple, the money that would not be accepted, the debt that turned into something else entirely, the grief that became room for something new, the careful man who had waited and then said true things and then taken her hand by a fence post in the summer sun. She thought about what she had been afraid of before she had allowed herself to want it, standing on someone else's generosity, losing the ground she had cleared herself. She had not lost it. She had added to it. The ground she stood on now was larger than what she had cleared alone, and it was entirely hers because she had built it freely, piece by piece, with full knowledge of every choice. Oliver looked up and found her in the doorway. The expression on his face, the slight change in everything, the quiet recognition, the look that had started as careful assessment in a field in 1879 and had become over years of living and working and choosing and loving the simplest, most direct thing in the world, that expression had not changed in its essential nature since the first time she had understood what it meant. She came inside. "I brought the supply receipts," she said. "I see them," he said. "Thomas has found your Emerson," she said. Oliver glanced at his son. "He's been wanting to read it for 2 weeks. Have you been discussing Emerson with our 6-year-old? He asked me what self-reliance meant." A pause. "I told him to ask his mother." She laughed, the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere she no longer had to locate consciously, the one that had existed freely since the moment she had stopped fighting the life she actually wanted. Thomas looked up from the book. "Papa says you understand self-reliance better than most," he said, with the seriousness of a child relaying important information. Lavinia looked at her son and then at her husband. "Your father," she said, "occasionally says true things." Oliver caught her eye and held it, and what passed between them in that moment was the full accumulation of everything they had been to each other. The lender and the widow, the business partners, the neighbors, the friends, the lovers, the husband and wife, the parents, the people who had refused each other the simple exits and stayed in the harder, realer, more beautiful complexity of a life genuinely shared. The summer afternoon moved through the office windows. Thomas turned back to his Emerson. Ezra Doyle pretended to be absorbed in his work with the professional tact of a man who understood he was in the presence of something he should not interrupt. Lavinia sat down across the accounts table from her husband, the way she had been sitting across tables from him for 9 years, and they went over the quarterly numbers together, with the receipts spread between them and the afternoon light around them, and the whole long, complicated, true story of how they had gotten here settled into the background like a landscape you no longer have to look at to know it is there. The accounts were in excellent order. They were always in excellent order. The herd on Bluff Creek that fall numbered 72 head. The market garden had supplied 3 Caldwell stores through the summer. Thomas Oliver Finley was reading Ralph Waldo Emerson at age 6. Clara Ann was 4 and already negotiating with Court Davies about the proper way to approach horses. James Henry was 1 year old and currently restricted from the fence posts by mutual parental agreement. The Bluff Creek property had 42 acres plus a water right on the creek, fully surveyed, cleanly titled, signed in both their names. And the leather pouch was in the drawer of the writing desk, empty, which was exactly right, because everything it had once held had been put to its proper use long ago. The debt was long settled. What had replaced it could not be tallied in any ledger Oliver Finley had ever kept, but it was the best account he had ever opened, and it had been growing without any sign of stopping since a June morning in 1881, when a woman with a leather pouch and $240 and an absolute refusal to accept anything less than what was true had walked through his office door and changed the entire shape of the rest of his life. He would not have taken the money then. She would not have accepted his refusal, and neither of them in the end had needed to. The real transaction had always been something else entirely, the kind that goes beyond coin and contract, beyond debt and settlement, into the territory where two people recognize each other clearly and choose each other freely and build, on ground they have cleared themselves, something that lasts.